The year was 1932, and the place was a narrow valley just outside Houghton, in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where winter was not a season but a force that shaped how people thought, built, and survived. Her name was Eleanor Pike, and she lived alone in a small timber house set back from the road, its roof heavy with old cedar shingles and its foundation laid by hand decades earlier. The house was ordinary by every measure. 2 rooms downstairs. A low ceiling upstairs where heat never quite reached. A hand pump at the sink. A cast-iron stove that ruled the center of the kitchen like a stubborn monarch. Nothing about the house suggested innovation. Nothing about Eleanor suggested rebellion. She was 47 that winter. Widowed young. No children. No brothers nearby. Just a narrow parcel of land, a woodlet behind it, and neighbors who had watched her quietly age into solitude. What made them talk was not who she was. It was what she decided to do. It began in late September, when the nights sharpened and the first yellow leaves fell into the ditches. Most families were already stacking their winter firewood then, building tall racks beside their houses or piling logs against barns and sheds. Dry wood was life here. Wet wood meant smoke, cold rooms, and long nights awake feeding a stove that never quite warmed. Everyone knew the rules. Cut in spring. Split in summer. Stack high. Cover the top. Pray the snow stayed light. Eleanor followed none of them. Instead of stacking her wood outside, she began digging. At first, no one understood what she was doing. They saw her carrying a shovel down the slope beside her house, near the north wall where the ground stayed cool even in August. They saw wheelbarrow loads of earth hauled away and dumped behind the woodlet. They saw stone hauled from the creek bed. Flat stones. Heavy ones. Chosen carefully. By the second week, it became obvious this was not a simple root cellar. She was digging deep. Neighbors slowed their wagons when they passed. Men leaned on fence rails. Someone laughed and said she'd lost her sense. Another said the ground there flooded every spring. A third said frost would tear it apart. One afternoon, old Walter Kessler walked over, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets despite the mild day. "You planning to bury yourself down there?" he asked, peering into the pit. Eleanor rested both hands on the shovel handle. Her sleeves were rolled. Dirt streaked her forearms. "No," she said. "Just my firewood." Walter stared at her, then laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "Firewood belongs in the air," he said. "Sun and wind. You put it underground, you'll rot it clean through." Others said worse. They said moisture would seep in from every side. That snowmelt would turn it into a bog. That mice would take over. That the walls would collapse. That she was wasting strength she didn't have. Someone said it plain, in the general store, loud enough for her to hear. "She's desperate," they said. "Or stubborn. Or both." Eleanor bought her flour and sugar and said nothing. What they didn't know was that she had already lost a winter to wet wood. 3 years earlier, the snow had come early and heavy. Her stacked logs had looked fine from the outside, but inside they were green with moisture. She had burned them anyway, coughing through December, watching frost bloom inside her windows. She had woken one morning with her hands numb and her breath shallow, the stove cold because the wood refused to catch. She had survived that winter by burning furniture she couldn't replace. A chair. Then a table leaf. Then the last crate her husband had made before he died. She would not do that again. So she dug. She dug until the pit was taller than she was deep. She dug until the soil turned dense and cool. She laid stone by hand, fitting each piece tight, dry stacked without mortar, angled slightly inward so pressure would hold them together. She left a narrow gravel trench at the bottom, sloped toward the creek, so any water that found its way in would leave again. She worked alone. She did not explain herself. When her hands blistered, she wrapped them. When her back ached, she rested against the cool stone. When the first frost came early, she worked faster. By October, the shape of it was clear. An underground room, rectangular, no more than 7 feet high. Stone walls thick enough to hold the earth back. A ceiling framed with heavy timber, sealed with planks and packed with soil above. 2 narrow vents, lined with pipe salvaged from an old stove, set high on opposite walls. "Air in," she said quietly, tapping one pipe. Air out. No one listened. They said cold air would freeze the wood solid. They said dampness would settle. They said she was building a tomb for good firewood. When she began carrying split logs down into the space, stacking them carefully, bark side down, ends facing the vents, the laughter returned. Next she'll be storing snow to keep it cold, someone joked. Eleanor kept stacking. She left space between rows. She stacked no higher than her shoulders. She placed kindling in crates along one wall, lifted off the ground. She spread a thick layer of gravel across the floor so nothing touched bare earth. By the time the first rayal snow came, the entrance was framed and fitted with a heavy wooden door, insulated with wool scraps and lined with tar paper. It faced east, sheltered from the worst winds. She stood back one evening as the sky darkened early, breath white, and looked at what she had built. It did not look impressive. It looked quiet. The neighbors shook their heads. They stacked their wood high and open, trusting tradition and luck. They spoke of long winters ahead, of storms coming off Lake Superior, of cold that split iron. Someone said Eleanor would be begging for dry logs by January. She heard that too. She said nothing. The snow came early that year. By mid-November, the ground was locked. By December, the drifts reached the lower windowsills. Wind howled through the valley, stripping heat from anything exposed. Eleanor closed her door, banked her stove, and waited. And beneath her house, beneath the frozen ground and the mocking voices, her firewood sat in darkness, untouched by snow, untouched by wind, breathing slowly through two narrow pipes. No one could see that yet. But winter was just beginning. By early December, the valley had settled into the kind of silence that only came after the first real cold. Snow no longer fell softly. It came sideways now, driven hard by wind off the lake, scouring fields down to crust and ice. Roads narrowed. Wagons stayed put. People spoke in shorter sentences and watched their stoves more closely. This was the season that separated comfort from endurance. Eleanor felt it in her bones before it showed on the thermometer nailed beside her door. The mornings were sharper. The air inside her house felt thinner, as if it resisted warmth. She rose before light as she always had, pulling on wool socks she had mended too many times, lighting the lamp with careful hands. Each morning began the same way. She knelt at the stove, opened the iron door, fed it wood, listened. Sound mattered. Dry wood spoke differently. It caught with a clear crack, a confident flame. Damp wood hissed, soaked, filled a room with smoke that never quite left. That sound haunted her. She remembered the winter she'd nearly lost the house to cold. How she had rationed heat, burning only mornings and evenings. How she had slept in her coat. How the walls had creaked and snapped like bones. How the kettle had frozen solid one night because she'd let the fire die too far down. That winter had taken something from her. Not just furniture. It had taken certainty. Now, everything she had depended on the decision she'd made in the dirt. The neighbors had families to buffer them. Children who slept 3 to a bed. Wives who cooked and kept fires fed in shifts. Sons who split wood until their shoulders ached. Eleanor had only herself. If her wood failed, there would be no backup. No borrowed armload. No pride-swallowing visit after dark. She had calculated that too. The underground room held enough wood for 5 months if burned carefully. That meant strict mornings. Controlled evenings. No waste. No false warmth. She counted logs as she carried them upstairs, stacking them near the stove in small, deliberate piles. 2 for the morning. 3 for the night. 1 extra for storms. Her body already felt the strain of the year's labor. The digging had cost her weight she could not afford to lose. Her hands were slower now, stiff in the cold. Her breath caught if she hurried. Some nights, lying in bed under heavy quilts, she listened to the wind press against the house and wondered if the others were right. Underground meant cold. Cold ground. Cold stone. No sun. No breeze. What if she had misunderstood something simple? What if the vents froze over? What if moisture collected unseen? What if she had built the perfect trap for dampness? The thoughts came worst just before sleep. She would picture the wood below her, dark and heavy, soaking slowly in cold air. She would imagine opening the door weeks later to find it ruined. So, useless. She forced herself to stop. The logic had been sound. The techniques were not new. She had read about old storage pits used by trappers and foresters. She had watched how snow insulated the ground, how deep earth held steady temperatures long after the air above froze. She reminded herself that panic wasted energy. By Christmas, the cold deepened. The Kesslers burned through their outside stacks faster than expected. So did the millers up the road. The snow had come wet in early November, soaking the bottom courses of their piles before freezing solid. Now they fought with that looked dry but burned poorly. Smoke hung low in the valley some mornings, trapped under heavy air. People complained more openly now. Walter Kessler muttered in the store about splitting frozen logs with numb fingers. Mrs. Miller said her stove pipe clogged twice in 1 week. Someone else said they might need to cut more, even though the forest road was nearly impassable. No one asked Eleanor anything. That was almost worse. She moved through town quietly, aware of eyes on her but no words. She carried herself carefully, conserving strength. She did not brag. She did not volunteer information. Inside, tension coiled. Every time she opened the door to the underground room, she paid attention. She smelled the air. She touched the logs. She watched for condensation on the stone. The space stayed cool. Not cold. Cool like a cellar. The air moved gently through the vents, barely perceptible but steady. The gravel floor remained dry. So far, so good. Still, the real test had not come. January in the Upper Peninsula was not measured in days. It was measured in endurance. In how long the cold stayed. In how often the wind rose. In whether the snow crust held or broke underfoot. Eleanor marked the days on a scrap of paper tacked near the stove. She knew what was coming. Everyone did. They spoke of it in low tones, like a thing that listened. The long freeze. The storms that buried doors. The nights when fire was the only difference between life and death. When it arrived, there would be no fixing mistakes. Only consequences. Eleanor sat at her small table one evening, hands wrapped around a mug of thin tea, and listened to the wind begin to rise. The house creaked. The stove ticked. Snow rattled against the shutters. She thought of the room beneath her feet, of the stones she had set, of the wood stacked with care. And for the first time since she'd started digging, she allowed herself to feel what she had been holding back. Fear. Not loud. Not panicked. Quiet. Focused. Heavy. Because if the underground shelter failed, it would not just mean cold nights. It would mean the loss of the last thing she truly owned. Control. She set the mug down, added one measured log to the fire, and waited. By the second week of January, the ground above the underground room had hardened into something like iron. The snow lay thick enough to swallow fence posts. Daylight came late and left early. The world shrank to what could be reached before fingers numbed and breath burned. This was when Eleanor stopped worrying about what others said and focused entirely on what worked. Each visit to the underground room followed the same careful routine. She never rushed. She never carried more than she could handle. The door opened inward, heavy but balanced, its hinges greased with rendered fat so they would not seize. Cold air slipped in briefly, then settled. Inside, the temperature surprised her every time. It was steady, not warm, but never biting. The stone walls held the earth's quiet. The gravel floor absorbed moisture without complaint. The logs were dry to the touch. When she knocked two together, they rang solid. No hiss. No softness. She had stacked them deliberately, following rules she'd learned the hard way. Ends exposed to airflow. Bark down to shed moisture. No wood touching stone directly. No overcrowding. The vents mattered most. They were nothing fancy. 2 lengths of pipe, scavenged and scrubbed clean. One entered low on the east wall. The other exited high on the west. No caps. No screens. Just simple openings protected by angled wooden hoods above ground to keep snow out. Cold air slid in low. Warmer air, carrying moisture, drifted out high. Slowly. Constantly. It was not ventilation you could feel. It was ventilation you trusted. When Eleanor hauled wood upstairs, she paid attention to how it burned. That was the truth test. No theory mattered once flame touched log. The wood caught quickly. Flames rose clean and bright. The stove warmed evenly. Smoke thinned and climbed the flue without resistance. She noted the difference in how much she needed. One less log in the morning. One less at night. It added up. By the end of January, she had burned nearly a third less wood than the winter 3 years before, even though the cold was worse. Outside, failure was becoming visible. The Miller boys were cutting again, hauling green wood through snow so deep it soaked their boots. Walter Kessler's stack had collapsed after a storm, burying half his supply. He burned what he could salvage, complaining of smoke and ash. One evening, Eleanor heard shouting down the road. A chimney fire. Scary. Contained, but only because neighbors came running. Dry wood burned clean. Wet wood burned angry. People noticed. They noticed Eleanor's chimney too. It smoked lightly in the mornings. Almost not at all by midday. At night, just a thin ribbon against the stars. Someone said it wasn't natural. Someone else said she must be burning coal. She wasn't. Coal cost money she didn't have. The truth was simpler. Underground, protected from snow and wind, her wood stayed what it was meant to be. Still, she didn't explain. When Walter finally asked her outright, it wasn't curiosity. It was irritation. "You always been this lucky?" he said, standing at the edge of her yard, stamping his feet. "Or you hiding something?" Eleanor shrugged. "Just burning what I stacked." He snorted. "Ain't no stack that dry this late." She looked at him then. Really looked. "You're welcome to see it," she said. He hesitated. Men like Walter didn't enjoy being shown things by women. Not quietly. Not without argument. "I don't need to see a hole in the ground," he muttered. "Suit yourself," Eleanor said, and went back inside. The underground room did not care. February came hard. Temperatures fell below zero and stayed there. Not for hours. For days. The kind of cold that made trees crack at night like distant gunshots. The kind that froze breath in scarves. People burned through reserves fast. Eleanor adjusted again. Shorter fires. Tighter control. She trusted the stove and the wood to do their work. She trusted the system. Once, after a blizzard, she had to dig out the vent hoods. Snow had drifted high enough to choke airflow. She cleared them carefully, knowing better than to let air stop moving. That was the only intervention the room needed. No leaks. No frost inside. No mold. No rut. The ground insulated everything. Even as the air above dropped to 20 below, the room below hovered just above freezing. Cold enough to keep moisture from building. Warm enough to prevent ice. The logic held. The critics grew quieter. Not because they were convinced. Because they were busy surviving. By late February, word spread without Eleanor's help. Someone noticed she hadn't been to the woodpile since December. Someone else noticed she never asked for help. Someone counted her chimney smoke and compared it to their own dwindling stacks. One afternoon, Mrs. Miller came by under the excuse of borrowing yeast. "It's warmer in your house," she said, eyes scanning the walls. "Even near the floor." Eleanor handed her the yeast. "Stone holds heat," she said. "So does dry wood." Mrs. Miller hesitated. "Is it true you keep yours underground?" Eleanor met her eyes. "It works." That was all. By the time March approached, something subtle had shifted in the valley. People stopped laughing. They stopped warning. They started watching. And beneath the frozen earth, the underground room kept doing what it had been built to do. The storm that tested everything arrived without drama, which was how the worst ones always came. It began as light snow in the early hours of February 17th, the kind people barely acknowledged anymore. By noon the wind picked up, pushing the flakes flat and fast, scouring fields into white sheets. By nightfall, the sound changed. Snow no longer whispered. It struck. Eleanor knew that sound. She banked the stove early and checked the vents one last time before dark, brushing loose powder from the wooden hoods with bare hands that stung immediately. The air burned her lungs. She counted her steps carefully on the way back inside, knowing how easy it was to slip and how long it took for help to arrive in weather like this. The door shut. The house settled. The wind began to howl in earnest. By morning, The valley was erased. Snow had piled past the windowsills. Drifts pressed against doors. The road vanished completely. Even the familiar shapes of trees dissolved into a white wall that moved and screamed. The temperature dropped steadily. 10 below. 15. 20. Then the wind drove it lower. This was the kind of cold that punished mistakes quickly. Walter Kessler's stove went out that morning. The wet logs he dragged in hissed and smoked, refusing to burn hot enough to keep the fire alive. He tried splitting more, but the wood froze his fingers within minutes. By afternoon, his breath fogged the inside of his windows. The Millers fared worse. Their youngest woke crying, hands stiff with cold. Mrs. Miller tried to boil water but couldn't keep the fire steady. Smoke filled the room, making the children cough. By evening, Mr. Miller tied a scarf around his face and pushed into the storm, heading toward town in search of coal or dry scraps. He did not make it far. Others suffered quietly. Chimneys clogged with creosote and frozen soot. Stoves burned too low or too hot, cracking iron. Snow buried woodpiles completely, forcing people to dig blind, pulling out logs that shattered when dropped. The storm did not care about experience. It punished exposure equally. Eleanor stayed inside. She had prepared for this kind of isolation without ever naming it. She kept food near the stove, water in covered buckets, a lantern ready. Her firewood sat stacked neatly within arm's reach, dry and obedient. She fed the stove slowly. Never too much. Never too little. The heat built evenly. The stone foundation absorbed it and released it back into the room long after the fire settled. Her breath stayed steady. Her hands stayed flexible. At night, she lay awake listening. The house groaned under the weight of wind and snow. Ice formed in the corners of the windows. The stove ticked softly as it cooled between feedings. Below her, the underground room remained unchanged. No drifting snow reached it. No wind scoured its walls. The temperature down there barely moved. The vents continued their quiet exchange, unseen but relentless. On the third day, the storm intensified. Snow found its way through every crack it could exploit. Drifts buried doors completely in some houses. A roof collapsed down the road under the weight of ice and wet snow layered over old accumulation. A chimney fire flared briefly in town, visible even through the white haze, until someone managed to smother it. That night, Eleanor heard a knock. It came faintly at first, almost lost in the wind. She froze, listening. Then again. Louder. Urgent. She pulled on her coat and opened the door just enough to see. Walter Kessler stood hunched in the storm, face red and raw, breath ragged. "I can't keep it going," he shouted over the wind. "The stove. The wood. It's all wrong." Eleanor hesitated only a moment. She did not invite him inside. Not yet. She grabbed a bundle of split logs from her stack and shoved them into his arms. "Burn these," she said. "Slow. One at a time." He stared at the wood, confused even as his hands closed around it. "Where?" "Go," she said. "Now." He went. She shut the door and leaned against it, heart pounding harder than the storm outside. She could spare a little, but not much. The underground room had been built to last the winter, not the neighborhood. By the fourth day, the wind finally eased. The snow stopped falling, leaving behind a landscape buried and broken. Smoke rose unevenly from chimneys that still worked. Some did not smoke at all. People emerged slowly, digging outdoors, calling to one another across drifts. Walter came back that afternoon, walking carefully, carrying the empty bundle. "That wood," he said, voice hoarse, "burned clean. Like it was cut yesterday." Eleanor nodded. "Where'd you keep it?" he asked. She looked past him at the snow-covered ground beside her house. "Underground." He did not laugh. The storm had taken laughter with it. All around the valley, people counted losses. Supplies gone, strength spent, pride bruised. And quietly, without spectacle, Eleanor's crazy decision had passed its hardest test. Winter had done its worst. The underground room had not failed. When the storm finally released its grip, it left the valley changed. Not ruined, not destroyed, but reshaped. Snow lay packed hard as stone. Roads reopened slowly, carved out by shovels and plows borrowed from the county. People moved differently now, careful and subdued, conserving what little strength winter had not yet taken. The first thing everyone noticed was what Eleanor did not do. She did not go out to cut more wood. She did not ask to borrow. She did not burn furniture. Her chimney told the story before she ever did. Thin smoke in the mornings. Almost nothing by noon. A steady thread again in the evening. No coughing fits. No soot-stained windows. No frantic feeding of the stove. Someone counted days. Someone else counted logs. Walter Kessler, to his credit, spoke first. In the store, with half the town listening, he cleared his throat and said, "That which she gave me burned for 3 hours on one stick." 3 hours was not a boast here. It was evidence. People began to ask questions carefully, as if the ground might still be listening. How deep was it? How dry did it stay? Didn't it freeze solid? Eleanor answered only when asked directly. 6 feet down, she said once. Gravel floor. Stone walls. Air in low. Air out high. What about moisture? Someone asked. It leaves, she said simply, if you give it a way out. No one argued. Numbers mattered now. By the start of March, Eleanor had burned just under 60% of her stored wood. In previous winters, she would have been nearing empty. Her stove stayed cleaner. Her flue needed less scraping. Her indoor temperatures stayed above 50 even on the coldest nights. She kept records without calling them that. Chalk marks inside a cupboard. Ticks for each log burned. Notes on how long the fire held. Quiet proof. People came to see it. Not all at once. One at a time. Under excuses. Mrs. Miller brought bread. Another neighbor came with eggs. Someone else claimed curiosity about the stonework. Eleanor led them down carefully, lantern held steady, never rushing. The underground rooms smelled of wood and stone. People touched the walls. The logs. The floor. This shouldn't be dry, someone whispered. It is, Eleanor said. Word spread outward. By the end of the month, 2 men from farther down the valley walked up through the snow to see it for themselves. They asked sharper questions. About vent placement. About soil type. About drainage. Eleanor answered what she could. I'm not an engineer, she said once. I just paid attention. The consequences came quietly too. The Millers rebuilt their wood shed in spring, sinking it lower, protecting it from wind. Walter tore down his collapsed stack and began planning something new. Others stopped stacking wood straight on the ground. No one called Eleanor crazy anymore. They called her careful. They called her prepared. The idea did not turn into a rush or a fad. It became something slower, something earned. People adapted it to their land, their soil, their needs. Not copies. Variations. Eleanor watched all of it with a mix of relief and distance. She did not want recognition. She wanted the next winter to hurt less. When April came and the thaw began, she opened the underground room fully for the first time in months. Meltwater ran down the hillside and into the gravel trench, just as she had planned. The stone walls held. The wood stayed dry. She stacked what remained outside to season for the next year, smiling faintly at how light the work felt compared to before. Walter stopped by one evening, hat in his hands. I was wrong, he said. Eleanor nodded. Most of us are at least once. He hesitated. You saved me. She shook her head. I saved my wood. That was the truth. And in a valley shaped by winter, truth mattered more than pride. For the first time since she'd put shovel to ground, Eleanor slept without calculating losses. Winter had not beaten her. It had taught her. And others were finally listening. Spring came the way it always did in the Upper Peninsula. Slowly. Reluctantly. As if winter had to be convinced to leave. Snow shrank in stages. First along the south-facing walls. Then in long, gray channels beside the road. The ground softened in patches, giving off the smell of wet earth and pine needles that had been buried for months. Eleanor watched it all from her porch, hands wrapped around a mug, feeling a quiet satisfaction she had not known in years. The underground room did not collapse. It did not flood. It did not rot her firewood or fill with mold or freeze solid like so many had predicted. It simply endured. By May, when the frost finally released its grip on the deeper soil, Eleanor went down one last time to clear it fully. The stone walls were unchanged. The gravel floor had done its work. The vents, rusted a little now, still carried air. She stood there for a long moment, lantern light resting on empty space where stacked wood had once stood. The room felt larger without it. That was when she understood what she had really built. Not a shelter. A margin. A small, hard-won buffer between herself and disaster. Others began building their own versions that summer. Some were crude. Some were shallow. Some failed in small ways and taught their builders quickly. But the idea took root, not as a rumor or a miracle, but as a method. Quiet intelligence spread best that way. Walter asked her advice once, then followed it without argument. The Millers dug theirs near a slope and learned the importance of drainage the hard way. A man from town built one too close to his foundation and rebuilt it farther out. No one blamed Eleanor for mistakes. They blamed Winter, as they should have. Years passed. Eleanor aged into her routines. Her hair went gray. Her steps slowed. But each autumn, when the leaves fell and the air sharpened, she prepared with the same calm she had earned. Wood was cut early, split properly, stored with intention. She never again burned furniture. When the winters came hard, as they sometimes did, she watched neighbors struggle less. Chimney fires became rare. Smoke thinned. Nights grew quieter. The underground rooms did not make life easy. They made it survivable. And that mattered more. Eleanor died quietly one spring years later, in her sleep. No drama. No crisis. The house passed to distant family, then eventually to another woman who learned quickly why the ground beside the north wall mattered. The underground room remained. Stone does not forget good work. Neither does a community that learned, finally, to value results over opinions. In the end, Eleanor Pike was not remembered as clever or stubborn or strange. She was remembered as someone who paid attention. Someone who listened to the land instead of the noise around it. Someone who understood that survival rarely announces itself. It just works quietly when it has to. Optional disclaimer. This story is inspired by real historical survival techniques. Characters and events are fictionalized for storytelling purposes.